dele al botón que dice cede la palabra. Está en la reunión, solo que no está en pantalla.
A eso me refería. O sea, podemos quedarnos así, desconectados,
sí,
pero en línea. No sé si me explico.
En línea, pero no en pantalla.
Perfecto.
Muchísimas
Muchas
gracias. Buenos días, señor Falconi.
Buenos días, ¿cómo está?
Buenos días, muy bien.
¿Me escucha?
Sí, se le ve y se le escucha muy bien.
Qué bueno. Quería pedirle un favor de mi lado. ¿Será que podría ustedes presentar la presentación? Porque no quería que me cubra toda la pantalla y yo voy diciendo el próximo slide si es posible.
Su presentación.
Se llama, déjeme buscarle, se llama, deme un segundo que le mandé hoy a Camila. Le mandé una versión a Camila hoy y me comentó que se la compartió con usted. El día de hoy se llama...
Deme un segundo.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos, no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Road Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo del público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces, nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos, no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, The Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Road Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas.
Expertos, damos inicio a nuestro tercer día de la 41ª reunión.
Kick off our third day of the experts meeting of MESASEEK. And today we're going to talk about transparency of beneficial owners. And in keeping with our agenda, this is item 4. First of all, we're going to have an expert panel. Some of them are with us remotely, others are here in person. We have a representative from UNODC, from the World Bank, from the Inter-American Development Bank, International Transparency, and other networks. We will then have member states that present. Given the importance of this topic, and as we've done previously, we will have webcasting through YouTube and other official accounts of the OAS. I'd like to ask participants to state their interest in participating. So we're also going to share experiences. Experts from different organizations will do this. And also member states will share their experiences. And this will be very useful for everyone. First of all, we have our panel of international organizations. The chair believes this is a very important issue because we have this link between prevention and fighting corruption, especially with respect to beneficial owners. This is key to preventing corruption and fighting against corruption because this is going to contribute to stopping financing of terrorism, money laundering, and other crimes. This means we must identify those people who really benefit from illegal acts and businesses. This is an effective strategy to fight corruption. The chair applauds the efforts that have been undertaken by the technical secretary to put together this panel. This will allow our member states to benefit from this information. We want to highlight that this is an opportunity for all of us to establish synergies and to collaborate with international organizations. Each panelist will have 15 minutes for their presentation, and the Department of Conferences is going to be helping us. We will have a timer which they will have. It will appear on the screen, and that way everyone knows how much time they have left. When the presentations of the panelists have concluded, we'll have a round of questions and answers. At that point, participants can ask for the floor, and we will call upon them in the order they requested the floor. We'd like to begin with Mr. Felipe Falcone. He is from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Sir, you have the floor.
Buenos días, estimadas delegadas.
Esteemed delegates, I hope you can hear me. If you could share my PowerPoint presentation on the screen, I would appreciate it.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días.
Thank you very much. I'm Felipe Falcone. I'm a prevention official for the Americas from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. I wanted to begin by thanking you for this opportunity to be able to be with you and to talk about such an important issue, which is transparency with respect to final beneficiaries, especially with respect to what UNODC is doing. Under the UN Convention Against Corruption, the job of the UNODC is based on the convention, and the outcomes of its review mechanism and the mandates adopted by the states parties to the convention. So my intervention today will begin with what the convention states with respect to transparency on final beneficiaries. And then I will address the review mechanism of the convention. Thereafter, I will talk about the resolutions that have been adopted on this matter, and I will give you some specific examples with respect to technical assistance that UNODC has undertaken. Next slide, please. As we know, one of the pillars of the UN Convention Against Corruption is transparency, specifically with respect to final beneficiaries or transparency thereon. There are 3 specific articles that we need to highlight. Article 14, paragraph 1. Article 14 talks about prevention of money laundering, and paragraph 1 demands that states party establish a domestic system with regulation and supervision of banks and financial institutions that are not banks in order to prevent and detect all kinds of money laundering. And it highlights some requirements. For example, those with respect to identifying clients and, when applicable, identification of final beneficiaries. Article 14, paragraph 1 of UNCAC also is linked to Article 52, paragraph 1, and that's in the chapter referring to recovery of assets. And this chapter demands that states party make institutional or financial institutions identify the final beneficiaries. And for example, this is done when there are accounts that have very high sums in them. Now, this is not defined under the convention, but the entity must identify the final beneficiary of the accounts. Now, it's important to know the final beneficiary, but this is not just to prevent money laundering. It is also an anti-corruption tool and can be used in many ways. Just to give you an example, if we're talking about public corruption, states need to know who they are contracting with, who is benefiting from these public contracts, because there may be persons that are not permitted to do business with a state, and we need to prevent them from doing so. Then we have Article 12, which speaks to the private sector and requires that states adopt measures to prevent corruption in the private sector. It gives us examples of measures to do this. For example, promote transparency amongst private entities, including measures to identify natural and legal persons when there is management of businesses, for example. But I want to talk about final beneficiaries and give you a definition thereof. What does the convention say about the definition of final beneficiaries? The convention does not provide for a definition of final beneficiaries, or not a definitive one. But in the review mechanism, and I'm sure that the panelists, other panelists will refer to this, it's in a glossary on standards with respect to fighting corruption and fighting money laundering. And so the financial group says this includes individuals who are the owners of an entity or control an entity, and on behalf of whom they carry out transactions. So this is someone who has a definitive or effective control over an entity, a legal entity. Now, what does it mean, control? What does ownership mean? What does final and definitive beneficial ownership mean? We don't have time to go into that, but I wanted to give you a general definition since I only have a little bit of time. Now, next slide. Due to time restrictions, I'm not going to delve into all this, but I want to go back to what I mentioned previously, based on what does UNODC carry out its technical assistance? Well, first, based on the convention and also based on the resolutions of the states party to the convention. The Conference of Parties meets every 2 years, and it adopts resolutions to guide our work and to highlight topics of interest recognized by the international community with respect to the transparency of final beneficiaries. At the last two meetings of the COPs, for example, last year we had one in Atlanta and then there was one in Sharm el-Sheikh. There were two specific resolutions adopted which talk about transparency of beneficial owners. This was Resolution 9/7 and Resolution 10/6. You can see them on the screen. Both resolutions highlight the need and the importance to have information about final beneficiaries, and it encourages states to provide information or collect information that is accurate about final beneficiaries. The political declaration that was adopted by the General Assembly in their meeting on the fight against corruption in 2021, well, there was a provision that said that there must be greater transparency with respect to final beneficiaries, and that states needed correct and reliable information that was timely with respect to beneficial ownership, and that states had to have access to this information. Now, let's go back to the review mechanism. The review mechanism was created as a tool to support states party in order to best implement the UNCAC. But in addition to being a tool for the states party, it's also a tool for UNODC to be able to provide technical assistance as states need. Now, with respect to final beneficiaries or beneficial owners, Articles 2, 14, and 52 that I mentioned from the convention, the most frequent challenges include the need to improve transparency with respect to owners and administrators of private entities, improve identification means to know who the final beneficiary is, and another problem has been the lack of identifying foreign final beneficiaries. The mechanism also talks about best practices. In Article 12, there is a best practice, which is establishing electronic means to publish information about final beneficiaries.
Next slide, please. Coming back very quickly to the question of technical assistance, which UNODC is currently offering, let me say this. For that technical assistance to be tailored to the clients who request it, we insist on regional platforms. There's a reason for this. They are conformed, as you imagine, by a number of countries voluntarily so that they can deploy joint efforts in order to move forward in the way they choose. This, of course, is based on best practices and timely intervention. There are 3 such platforms, one in Central America, another, and that, the speaker corrects himself, Central America, South America, and Mexico, and the Caribbean. Let me focus on the one in Central America that focuses there, in the case of the private sector, on how to boost due diligence and the effective and timely identification of the final beneficiary. South America and Mexico have, in their 2022-2024 roadmap, an emphasis under Section 1 very much on the private sector corruption. And number 3 involved increasing the transparency with regard to the final beneficiary, which is what we're discussing at present. The UNODC is very much focused, of course, on helping these states parties on the basis of the debates that have been held and the needs that have been pinpointed at the time of an examination and the main issues on the platforms, in order to strengthening the states parties' ability to boost their transparency with regard, yet again, to final beneficiaries. One way to do that has been to carry out specific studies to help the experts in their search for such final beneficiaries. I could have given you more information on the details pertaining thereto. There's one in particular that UNODC has carried out that encompasses 65 states parties and the regime in 55 of them, always, I say again, with a focus on the final beneficiaries. To the left, you can see here a segment that is taken precisely from that part of the text, the need to strengthen and to make more evident the final beneficiary. We looked at three in particular. On the right, you see a picture of the study that was carried out under what we call the STAR initiative. It is a joint initiative between the World Bank and UNODC. The idea being to pinpoint nominal societies, that is, totally fake societies, that aim specifically at hiding the final beneficiaries. And so it's a front business, in other words. Here, in the study, we drilled down on 65 states parties. 17 of them stated that there were registers available showing who the final beneficiaries were. Then there were 37 states parties that included those, of which 23 said that they are open to the public, 9 of which do it via a certain payment, 14 offer it for free, gratis. Now, this is a very quick sketch of what I'm talking about. I'm almost out of time, so I'm not going to burden you with additional details, but just a quick look as I come to the end of my presentation. You can see for yourself how we have broken down the various stages here in UNODC vis-a-vis technical assistance and the development of synergies. I've already given you a few details on the studies that we've carried out, but don't think for a minute that we're limited to the studies. What we very much want to do, and that's a no-brainer, is to increase the capacity and the talent of the people working in this field and their ability to tap precise, updated, and timely information. Best practices go to that end. And peer learning and sharing. And last but not least, as ever, international cooperation with regard to the information that spells out those final beneficiaries. I'm now out of time, so let me very much say, Duen, that we have worked with Honduras to draw up international standards on real property and all these other elements. We actually worked on a draft law on the subject and how we can improve our identification of these final beneficiaries. In Bogota, just last June, we held a meeting on transparency, inclusion, and anti-corruption. And there were specific sessions focused on final beneficiaries and best practices related thereto. I hope that the next time we meet, you all will want to come. we're going to be focused specifically on final beneficiaries and best practices. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I certainly am here to answer any questions. Do you have any? Thank you. Thank you, Felipe Freitas of the UNODC. We appreciate your vast experience and your sharing it. Going to hear now to Jana Esquivel of the World Bank. Thank you very much, says Yara Esquivel. I am very honored to be with you today. Let me say that Messisik mattered a lot to me early on in my career because I was working with the Attorney General in the public ministry, and the very first time that I sought the input of another country, it was availing myself of the OAS Convention on this very point. So the mechanism is very dear to me, and this convention, especially on the beneficial owner, is something that remains critical, not only to me. Isn't it nice that our region has so often, and this is a perfect example of it, been really breaking all records and moving into new territory? Let me say that we are working in a number of different areas at the World Bank. We look at various different global practices. Some deal with anti-corruption, another deals with governance, another one deals with tax matters. And what brings them all together, those three different areas, is precisely the question of the final beneficiary. So to me, this is like a wheel with spokes. You've got the various spokes. You've got tax, you've got anti-corruption, you've got the administrative measures, and of course money laundering, not to mention it because it's so obvious. But they are all connected where spokes are, at the center of the wheel. Now, none of this is very new, let's be clear. But I'd like to say that the book that was published on puppeteers, you remember that, really broke the ice. Then, of course, there was an unending series of leaks by the press with regard to the International Consortium on the Press and various others. Everybody has a leak, it would appear. Too many to count. But the point is, civil society, and through civil society, the countries are beginning to notice, oh yeah, it turns out the final beneficiary makes a difference. And Gafi, which is the mechanism that sets up the international standards on money laundering, has been looking at this for quite a while. Certainly what we had in 2011, we realized that the FATF, as it's known, FATF, wasn't enough. Good as it was, not enough. You had tax breaking the tax laws, breaking this, breaking that, but it always involved the final beneficiaries who, one way or another, were done in by the crimes against them. So I'm giving you a very quick sketch, but we knew early on where the changes were going to come up necessarily. Meanwhile, with FATF, we have been working to see how we could hone the standard as it existed in 2022. Beyond this, a point I'd like to make is that an organic and very, very positive change is that the very definition of the final beneficiary has been used in a cross-cutting manner by all of the bodies. Why do I say this? Because the first challenge I think that was noted in the last few years is that the criterion established for the final beneficiary did not quite serve the purpose everywhere. I was working in one country of this region, won't mention it, that had multiple definitions of the final beneficiary. Well, good luck. How are we going to move forward, I ask you, if even within one and the same country we couldn't reach agreement as to what it was we were talking about? So not only is it important that within one country the meaning of these concepts be clear, but certainly internationally they need to be clear. When we refer to a particular country and we're asked to speak to a given country, we always say, first piece of advice, choose your definition and stick to it. Because if you don't know who, say, your final beneficiary is, you're in trouble. The other point is, of course, as everybody sitting here recognizes, if we don't have clarity with regard to the beneficiary or any other point by that matter, how are we going to ask for information? Transparency, prosecutors, administrative issues. The list goes on and on. But the risk-based focus that FATF has been using since 2012 is key. Why is that? Because there are a number of individuals and juridical structures that have been generated that seemed like a great idea at the time. But when we've taken another look and seen how this is functioning, we have come to realize that there has to be a risk-based focus. We say again, risk-based focus. Because the risk-based focus is what's going to tell us what matters most. If you have an array of issues you've got to deal with, you better have a sense of where the greatest risk lies. And so on the basis of the FATF and the OECD principles, we have a better sense of how best we can determine the degree of risk from a tax perspective. What are these revenues going to be used for? Money laundering, et cetera, or simply avoiding the payment of tax? You need clarity as to risks. What are your risks? Where do you stand? Where are the individuals? Where are the institutions? And what are they doing? Yet another element that I must mention is the position of Latin America and the region at large with regard to the final beneficiary. Now, the FATF does not define as a necessity that there be such, but it's used because what FATF says that there has to be a set of mechanisms available to define who the beneficiary is, that final beneficiary. Whether it's the authorities that are going to implement the law or whether there are three different elements that are set forth in the standard, that can be used. But the one regionally, it would appear, that has struck us the most has to do with implementing the register. Now that, by the way, is no coincidence. That's what's used in Europe. And Europe, by the way, has kept registers of this kind for many, many years that precede the FATF. Now, the register may be fine and well, but guess what? Like so many other things in life, it has its pluses and its minuses. Ideally, we should be able to access the information very easily, and the information will surely be correct. It will surely be updated, and it is ideally just what you needed. I say ideally because if you look at the evaluations for each of these, Everybody seems to agree, all of the bodies a la FATAF that we've come up with in the fourth round, is that guess what? We are not in a good place. Not in Latin America and not worldwide. I can't give you the exact figures, but I can tell you this. In this last round, I think it was 20% were in red and please don't quote me because I'm not giving you gospel truth here, but it's close. On the consolidated information ain't good. And those who have an appropriate legal framework are no more than 20%. That I can tell you. And of the rest of the countries that are presumably implementing the standards of the final beneficiary, guess what? Are under, guess, 10%. Under 10%. So there you have the picture. We are way behind, ladies and gentlemen. So what have we got to do to catch up and find who is the magic final beneficiary? Well, you tell me. So what have we been doing at the World Bank? Well, we've done a couple of things. First of all, helping countries wade through their legislative changes so that there is such a thing as a legal framework to comply with the technical requirements. And if you have a final registry, it has to maintain updated information. It needs to be information that is not only updated, but that actually is valid, is true, is genuine, and that there be the obligation to offer that information, to exchange information, and last but not least, that there be a fine or a cost to those who choose not to inform, or worse yet, inform falsely with regard to these legal entities. We've done this in several countries. We were working with Panama, as a matter of fact, very closely with Panama, also Honduras, also Guatemala. We're working with a number of countries in the region. But in addition, we have offered this evaluation tool for persons and legal structures virtually to all of the countries of Central America. Each one of them, I believe, I'm not mistaken, has used this risk analysis, and a good number of those in South America have done that also. Just last week in Panama, we had representative of each WIF, each financial information unit, and we have been exchanging information on risk and on how these standards are being applied, not only from the strictly technical point of view, but also, last but not least, very much as to effectiveness. Is the thing working? And we've been working with our fiscal affairs counterparts, not only through our broad global outreach, but also through a hybrid team that we've set up. We've adopted the international practices, that is an all-of-government approach. We also have the whole of the World Bank focus. So we have a hybrid team, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And the colleagues that are working within it work with anti-money laundering, with the global practice, and we work with OECD and FATF, where there is an overlap, as you know. Some are distinctly different, some of those aspects, and curiously enough, in Latin America, most of the countries appear to have implemented their final beneficiaries within the context of the tax units. So, bottom line, this conversation isn't going to happen if we're not involving the tax authorities. And we also, of course, have set up workshops on identification of these final beneficiaries. You can't speak of the final beneficiary if you're not focused on the issue. And since we are, that's why we're called the World Bank, we are everywhere. I can tell you, for instance, that just last year, one country was saying that since we've worked together, they have managed to recoup, get this, some $10 million worth of assets that had been siphoned off through various forms of fraud. So this is worthwhile. There are lots of ways of tackling corruption, as we can see, and the final beneficiary register is not the least of it. As to administrative hiring, there too we have offered support to countries throughout the world in an attempt to adopt the updated FATF standard, where, again, the final beneficiary has pride of place. It's also key to ensure that the public hiring authorities are brought into the picture with regard to this final beneficiary. And the information on the final beneficiary, I'll tell you flat out, is probably the greatest challenge we're facing. Even the United Kingdom, dear friends, has only just passed a reform last year on this very point, because they realized that much of the information being provided was flat wrong. Whether deliberately or not is not mentioned, but the point is it wasn't right. And so it's important that both domestically and internationally more needs to be done. And I think we would do very well to borrow from the tax world to do better in the anti-corruption world. One helps with another. And there has to be the trust amongst us, and for that I think it's critical to say it flat out. It's important to have interagency cooperation. I'm way over time, and frankly I don't have much more to say. I think I've shared much of what I thought was key. This to say that the World Bank is very, very keen to help the countries of the region. I particularly love working in Latin America because I have the sense that we are the spearhead of this movement. We are way out there and have a lot to show for it and to show others. We've got the tools to continue doing just that. Spot the challenges and do something about them. My sense of Latin America is what I felt as a child in a sandbox. I get into the sandbox and play to see what I can do and come up with something interesting. So please let me tell you, you can count on us if you need us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Yares-Givel of the World Bank. I'm sure what you've said has been a key to all of us gathered here in Messiseek. I appreciate your input. Let me now give the floor to the Bank the Inter-American Development Bank, Mrs. Maria Cecilia Alvarez Bollea. Thank you very much for organizing this absolutely critical meeting and for inviting the IDB to be present. My presentation, I believe, is going to show how closely aligned we banks are. You've just heard from the World Bank. I'm speaking for the Inter-American Development Bank, and we have a lot in common. I work for the team on integrity and transparency within the unit of fighting the financing of terrorism and boosting financial transparency. So the standpoint of the IDB looks very much to the fiscal world and to the world fighting money laundering with regard to synergy, with regard to the application of international standards, as in within FATF and others, the OECD listing of final beneficiaries, and others who work on these key measures, such as you may describe them. some of your countries comply with and make reference to both of those standards, OECD and that is fiscal transparency and the other elements we have pointed out here. I think the question of final beneficiaries is really something that speaks for itself. It's clear, it's compelling. We need it to fight corruption, and we need to fight it to fight tax evasion, inter alia. In the 13 minutes I have available, I'm going to focus on a few points. First of all, how do we see the region of Latin America and the Caribbean with regard to the agenda on final beneficiaries? That's one. The other is, what is it that we in the IADB seek to support and to have implemented? First, how do we see Latin America and the Caribbean in this context? How does this region stand? Well, let me tell you, nobody's perfect. And the other point is, it's nowhere a blank page, because everywhere we've seen a great deal of progress over the last decade in the legal, regulatory, and other aspects of final beneficiaries. A lot has changed. As my colleague from the World Bank pointed out a minute ago, there are certainly critical challenges that have arisen in terms of the effective implementation of that set of final beneficiary registries. As you will know, the FATF focuses a lot on effective implementation. And we in the Inter-American Development Bank recognize that and back it fully. Again, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there has been a great deal of attention paid to these matters, together with the IMF and European Union meeting that was held on money laundering and tax issues. We spent a good deal of time focusing on these particular elements. There isn't any one rule that will do it with any particular jurisdiction. There is ongoing variance as between one region and another, but there is, in Latin America, in many countries, a trend. Which trend is to put these final beneficiary registries within the tax offices. That means that there is an institutional backstopping. There is the personnel that has been put up and tasked with following this matter. But, as I said earlier, there's no one rule that does the trick. What is important is that your overall system work, that it be solid, that it identify those financial beneficiaries, and that the authorities that should know of this have timely access to it.
What are the main challenges that we see on the horizon? First of all, verification of information. And this is one of the recommendations of FATF. The information should be updated and accurate. Countries have had difficulties in verifying information. And secondly, access to information by competent authorities, which may exist on paper in the regulations, but is difficult to put in practice, or it's not quick and efficient. So when we sit down with countries, they tell us about the difficulties they have on both ends to exchange information. In 2023, we organized a conference, and tax authorities and anti-money laundering units said these are the two issues they want to work on because these are difficulties that are important, and we're going to do a follow-up conference to focus on these two issues. What is the strategy of the IDB with respect to this agenda? How can we support our countries in this sense? We have a global focus, focusing on fiscal issues and money laundering issues. As you certainly know, the OECD uses the FATF definition with respect to standards, and we always try to have a joint approach that takes into account these two issues. How can we help countries? When we provide loans, we provide technical assistance, we help with transparency, we have a technical assistance unit. We've worked with the Dominican Republic, Chile, and others on this agenda. We try to provide knowledge and technical exchanges between countries, best practices. These exchanges are very useful to learn from other countries and from other regions. And together with the World Bank, the OAS, the IMF, the OECD, Treasury, we are very much aligned with international cooperation on these matters. And of course, we are observers to FATF and other organizations that work on these matters. Now, as I mentioned, we have technical assistance. That includes this double approach and compliance with both standards. With respect to technical assistance and the bank's support, we know there's no one-size-fits-all. We have the FATF standards. This does not establish that there is just one solution. We need a robust system that provides accurate information on the on beneficial ownership. We need countries to use their institutional framework to define the system or combination of systems that are best for the country in question's context, and to use the strengths of institutional and legal frameworks to be able to implement systems. For this reason, we always begin with a diagnosis or a diagnostic assessment to look at what the gaps might be with respect to beneficial ownership. This, as compared to OECD and FATF standards, taking into account technological and regulatory aspects. The technology is key when we want to find beneficial owners. Technological systems, software, etc., to be able to have efficient records and registers. Secondly, and it comes from this assessment, what are the measures to be implemented to strengthen this system? What is the action plan to strengthen the system? We've worked with the Dominican Republic recently, undertaking this assessment, and we complete the activity with a series of measures to be adopted in the short, medium, and long term to improve record keeping, and this is always in keeping with international standards. In practice, I'm going to mention some specific examples of how we've helped countries on this matter. First of all, assistance to create and design policies and systems, taking into account, obviously, the assessment that I mentioned. Secondly, when there is a system that exists, and the country wants to strengthen it or improve it, enhance its operations, or because recommendations have changed. FATF is working on improving systems to identify beneficial owners. We've been working with the Dominican Republic. We've been working with different institutions on this matter. And we work with not just a country's institutions that have the records. We also work with tax authorities and other authorities. Another best practice that has been very useful has been to exchange experiences and look at comparative experiences. And many times countries want to implement reforms, but they want to know about the experiences of other countries that have gone through similar processes. And there are many questions about this, and they're usually similar. Who has access to the records? What is the system? How do you identify and verify information? Is it public? Is it private? How can you exchange information rapidly, efficiently, quickly? And so all countries have similar questions. When a country identifies a system that could be adapted to its own jurisdiction, its own circumstances, the country wants to learn about similar experiences. And so we bring countries together. We've worked with Chile and other countries. We have closed meetings so that they can pose any question that they feel is appropriate with respect to policies on beneficial ownership. And finally, this has to do with technological issues, which are extremely important. We have a multidisciplinary unit, people who know about interoperability, technological capacities and systems, and integration with other systems of record, such as public procurement. And this is something we've worked on with many countries in the region. And finally, well, with respect to knowledge, the idea of transparency, of beneficial ownership is key on our agenda. So we've done a lot of work, a lot of written reports that we've published. You can see some on the screen. We call these toolkits about final beneficiaries or beneficial ownership. You can consult them. They're quite recent. These are practical guides to be able to implement these kinds of measures. We're currently updating them in light of new and revised recommendations. The third manual, this always together with the OECD and the World Economic Forum. You can consult this information or we have a link here. We have a QR code. That's where you can find all our work on this matter, not just publications, but also with respect to technical support and technical dialogues. We organized a conference in Buenos Aires in 2023, and we're going to organize other conferences in upcoming years. This with respect to beneficial ownership. We brought together different authorities from the tax side and other sides. For the IDB, this is a really important matter, so thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Alvarez, who is representing the Inter-American Development Bank. We now would like to give the floor to Transparency International, and Ms. Mayra Marini has the floor.
Hi. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Yes. Okay. Great. Thanks. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be speaking to all of you. It's a pity that I cannot be there in person. And I wanted to talk a little bit more from the perspective of what we have been studying and learning from the implementation of beneficial ownership registers throughout these years. I think in the past, we always talked a lot about what should be in place and why this was important. And we had really great progress with the review of the FATF recommendations, as the colleague was just describing. But I think now what I think is very interesting is relevant is that we have concrete examples that we can analyze and that we can learn from. And it is the implementation of registers in other countries I want to discuss a little bit more with you today and reflect on the lessons learned from these examples. But before I get to that, one other very important thing to bring to the debate is that, as we were just discussing the Financial Action Task Force review of the standards, and in most countries we see beneficial ownership transparency being discussed from an anti-money laundering perspective. And while this is really important, it's also crucial to keep in mind that the role of beneficial ownership information and the role that beneficial ownership data can play beyond money laundering to fight corruption in different sectors and in different areas. And I think that's really important to consider, particularly for those countries that are now thinking about implementing registers and putting in place frameworks to consider the different objectives that they should have in mind when implementing such a register, because this should then impact the type of access, who should have access, and how the information should be used. We have lots of examples of how beneficial ownership information have helped, for example, to uncover corruption in public procurement, or have been used to know and identify the owners of media, for example, or political party donations, or environmental crime. So I think the use of beneficial ownership information can be quite wide, and it's important that countries reflect and consider that when implementing their registers. But talking a little bit more about what we know about the success of registers and the implementation so far, I wanted to focus on 3 to 4 key learnings that we saw from the countries that have implemented registers. We mostly looked at some of the experience at the European Union level, because that's where the place where most registers have been in place for a longer period of time. The first topic that I wanted to bring to the attention when it comes to the implementation and things that people should keep in mind when putting in place the registers or reforming to improve the information in the registers is the issue of compliance. We looked, for example, at the implementation of the beneficial ownership register in France, and we found that 5 years after the publication of, since 2017, companies were required to disclose their beneficial owners. And we found that in 2023, only 1/3 of all legal entities that were active and registered in France, they haven't yet submitted their beneficial ownership information. So it really shows the problem here that you have a system in place that is supposed to be working and functioning, but in reality you have very low compliance rate, which then can miss the purpose, right? Because the information on the beneficial owners are actually not there and not available. The second issue, which I think was also mentioned in the previous presentation, has to do with quality of the data. A lot of the beneficial ownership registers have been created as part of either the company register and have been created as a way of like parking the information, with nobody in the government actually being responsible for and have the mandate to review the information, check the information, verify that the information is correct. And these, of course, translate into poor quality data, inaccurate data that then cannot be used for identifying, preventing crime. And this is unfortunately true because the analysis that we conducted across the European Union, once again, shows that in the great majority of countries, the only mechanism for verifying the information that is in place is a mechanism to rely on banks and other obliged entities to report discrepancy report. Actually, in the majority of countries, the only measure that is taken is to check an ID of the person. No other requirements to verify, to cross-check this information with other data sets and so on. I think there are only 3 countries across the European Union that have a more detailed and comprehensive verification mechanism in place. The Financial Action Task Force makes the distinction between verification of identity of the beneficial owner, but also the status of the beneficial owner. And we think it's really important that the status verification happens also on a regular basis and regardless of the risk level. So you need to make sure that the information that is there is correct, and then additional checks should be done based on the level of risks. The other topic that I wanted to talk, and that comes across very strongly in some of the evaluations and assessments we have done, is the issue of access. And of course, I could go on here talking about the importance of public access and ensuring access to civil society and journalists. That's the work we have been doing for many years. But I actually want to draw your attention to the access that is being given to law enforcement authorities, to financial intelligence units, to tax agencies, and other authorities in your countries that play a role in the fight against corruption. Because actually what we also found is that this access tends to be inadequate. And in many countries, authorities don't have direct access to the registers, and this directly impacts the way that they are using the data in the register. So instead of using the information to identify red flags, to identify potential leads, and to start investigations, they're being used in a very reactive manner. So you know that there is a problem, and then you request the information about that specific company. And worse than that, in some countries, law enforcement authorities cannot even do this themselves. They will need to go through a financial intelligence unit that then can access the register and then send again the information to that authority. In this, we lost their precious moments in an investigation and resources of the state that could be invested in a different manner. And on the other hand, what we learned when we talked to authorities using this data was that if they had direct access, and even better if they had API access, so open data access to beneficial ownership registers, they really built this into the way they work. So for example, the financial intelligence unit in one of the countries we analyzed, they use the direct information coming from the register is connected to several other databases that they have access, including information coming from suspicious transaction reports, and this helped them to improve their intelligence work significantly, providing them better quality information to law enforcement authorities in their countries. And this I'm talking only about the cases related to domestic access, no? When you need the information that is based in another country, the challenges are even greater. And that's where having public access can also facilitate, no? The use by authorities in other countries as well. And the final point I wanted to make, it is really about ensuring at least that journalists and civil society have some quality access to information. We have seen an interesting development at the European Union level. You probably know about the recent decision of the Court of Justice in the European Union that shut down public access to beneficial ownership registers, but emphasized the importance of ensuring access to law enforcement, to journalists and civil society organizations. And in this, what happened in some countries, we collected data about how some of the registers have been used, and it's very clear how important it is for civil society organizations and journalists to be able to access this data. There was, for example, 600,000 access by journalists and civil society to the register in Germany after the register was closed. So they request 600,000 times to access beneficial ownership data in a short period of time. And in the same period of time, there was only 6,000 access by authorities, which really show that authorities alone are not going to be able to undercover or investigate crimes, and the importance of having this access, also even to ensure the quality and accuracy of the information in the register. And a final point, and I think my colleague Andreas from Tax Justice Network will go a little bit more in detail in talking about some of the loopholes and the challenge there related to loopholes. And one thing that I wanted to stress that is really important for those countries that are establishing beneficial ownership registers is to really try to understand the risks posed by the legal entities that are operating in their countries. We have really concrete examples of countries where risk assessments haven't been comprehensive enough, haven't considered the risk of the different types of legal entities, and they end up excluding from beneficial ownership transparency regimes the important key types of legal entities. And it's really important then that you continuously assess the risk posed by different companies to make sure that you're not leaving any loophole in the register that could be abused by actors wanting to hide behind anonymous companies. I'll stop there, and thank you so much for having me.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Ms. Marine. We now will hear from our last guest from international organizations, and that is Mr. Andres Knobel. I'm sorry, we can't hear the speaker.
¿Se puede escuchar bien mi presentación?
Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you now. I'm going to share my screen with you.
Y tomarme el tiempo.
One moment, please. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event. In keeping with what Myra and other panelists have presented, I wanted to talk about beneficial ownership, transparency at a crossroads, and talk about why it is so important to focus on beneficial ownership. In many countries, I think that this is being focused on, or the issues that are being focused on are money laundering or others, but they are not focusing so much on beneficial ownership. Now, in this regard, there's been progress, but there's also been stagnation or perhaps even setbacks. Now, talking about progress, in our tax justice network, we've been looking at beneficial ownership for partnerships, legal entities, and others. in 140 jurisdictions. In 2018, only 34 countries had a law about beneficial ownership. In 2020, we had 81, and in 2022, 97. We have Canada and others that came on board. And so this progress came about before FATF's reform, which demands these kinds of records. And this is also a requirement for trust. And so there was a broadening of the scope of beneficial ownership registration, not just companies or legal persons, but also trust, which are very opaque and problematic, more so than companies. Following along with the progress that we've seen, Transparency International and Tax Justice Network believe that countries need to open up their registers to the public, for example, commercial registers, as well as registers of beneficial ownership. But because of tax secrecy laws, many times it's difficult to access these registers. Most countries, or in many countries, like in Argentina and Ecuador, any person can access beneficial ownership registers. Now, we talked about the progress that has been made, although it's limited, but where do we have stagnation? Well, when beneficial ownership laws are passed, and we see that this is the case in 96 countries, but only 72 have laws that have no loopholes, and only 41 have updated or require updated information, and only 12 countries have online beneficial ownership information, and only 7 have free and online beneficial ownership information. There are many obstacles. For example, it's easy in many countries to avoid complying with different requirements. There are high thresholds, for example, in Colombia, Ecuador. There are exceptions, listed companies, investment funds, trust, state-owned enterprises. They don't know to provide information about beneficial ownership, and this is also true with respect to foreign companies. With foreign companies, they don't have to say anything about beneficial ownership, rather only local businesses do.
And beginning with these offshore and other entities, let's face it, they are very kindly regarded in the laws in Latin America in particular, not to mention Panama. Now, sometimes this is a simpler structure than other times. Certain trusts just are simpler or not. But in fact, nothing in the concept of trust is alien to the country, whether you're buying furniture or whether you're the titular of a particular society. I mean, it's still an issue to spot the final beneficiary. Why? Because the powers given to trust offshore is a lot more complicated. when you're dealing with somebody who's dealing with the economic center, very often there is not really a full documentary backlog where the beneficiary has a great deal more. You may have a private trust company or trustee. That'll probably be the director or a shareholder. And sometimes in Latin America, they can be appointed or may never get some kind of distribution in the future. There are all kinds of different modalities that apply. You could set up a trust without beneficiaries. That's also possible. You have shares in the holding, but you'll never identify a particular income to a particular beneficiary. I mean, you name it, it exists. That's what I'm saying. There are all kinds of different cases that apply. You can even have an indirect beneficiary, just have a credit card, who knows. Then, of course, there is the question of the legislation in varying countries. In some cases, things are pretty simple. In other cases, they are fiendishly complex. So complexity, as I'm stating here, is most assuredly not prevented. Far from it. And people are free to do so. You could go to A, to B, to C, and A is the owner. Maybe has X percentage, and who knows who the final beneficiary is. I mean, you name it, it's possible. And we have examples of it. You have here in these various designs, in some cases, a pyramid situation here on the left, and other times with legal entities. Now, in some countries, every party has to be identified. It doesn't matter what the threshold is or what the amount, the capital is. And to add a trust beneficiary, you could simply thereby avoid identifying anybody else. In Europe, this was particularly favored. Just name a trust beneficiary and have done with it. Don't go to the physical individuals. Depending on who has the votes or who has the rights. Here you have the different designs. The fact of the matter is that there are many, many ways to exercise control. It could be a speculator that is simply looking to options, futures, or could be creditors who have the debt that has been morphed into actions, or shares, I should say. Interpreter corrects herself. But whether or not the person is listed as a shareholder, even indirectly, that can be the case. So what happens now with the ruling of the European Court of Justice in 2022 that rendered invalid public access for the AML? But in Ecuador, for instance, that doesn't happen. Even so, investigative journalists and civil society, as well as the firms that might have a legitimate interest, want the information, and they have a right to it. But if we see that these issues are not arising helter-skelter by chance, but there are those who are, in fact, launching a campaign to, as we're using the verb in English, weaponize privacy. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, I appeal to you and to my own authorities to be wise and take note. There's another holding that's pending on investigative journalists, CSOs, and other fiduciaries that are working against transparency in order to ensure that competent authorities don't get the information they need. For instance, to avoid taxes. There's a case in Belgium to that very point. It went back and forth. The one party lost, and the other one won, and they went back where they started. And at the end of the day, a ruling was handed down in Belgium. This had to do, as you see on the top of the list here, with an automatic exchange of banking information. And down here, the BEPS 12 and OECD rules, and there was the backsizing DAC 6. The idea is to hamper the filing of what is called SLAP lawsuits, which very often were frivolous, which costs, we all know how much that costs. It's not free, that's for sure. So the issue is, what is the cost of transparency, and what is the importance to the public of transparency? And everything we've been saying for some time, just last week, was confirmed. There was this last case that arose. I'm telling you, look, and this is March. This is last week. Webster v. HMRC. Read it out right there. Question had to do with transparency mechanisms, and there was an anonymous donor. And when the attorney and the judge asked for information, he or it, the party, refused to mention it. And we knew damn good and well who was financing this. It wasn't the name of the person that was on the list, but the power behind that particular party was indeed to make reaching this information as hard as possible. So what are our proposals when all of that is said and done, you may ask? Well, obviously, let's start there. Why is the public forum as important? Because it's important indeed to know why certain things are happening. When you have a party like Global Witness, you can quickly see how important it is that transparency not be there in name only, but when push comes to shove, that it'll make a difference. You can't have a company set up if it's sham. You can have it, but what point is there? And at the end of the day, you're going to find out that it is sham. And this goes to listed companies and investment funds. You want a definition without thresholds, and you want powers of attorney and financial instruments to be made clear too. You would wish to discourage complexity. That is, forget these discretionary trusts where you can't figure out who's where, regardless of the property, whether it's aircraft or buildings. And you want to be able to spot illicit enrichment. That's the name of the game. Who's getting dirty rich over who knows what money? This is the question. Where's the money come from? This is why this matters. And to that end, one needs to improve the quality of sworn statements as to what the assets are. You want to make sure, or do the best you can to make sure, that nobody is lying through their teeth. Thank you very much. Thank you, Agnes Lowell. That was a very potent statement, says the chair. We have a very few minutes, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any burning question that you need to ask our panelists, plural. I offer the floor, should anyone wish to take it.
Bueno, no existiendo ninguna intervención, daría.
Appears nobody has any question here, so with this we wrap up. No, I spoke too soon, the Dominican Republic.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Ante todo, felicitar a...
I must begin by applauding everyone's intervention because I'm most impressed, both those who were in this room and those who have joined us by Zoom. Everyone contributed, I think, very potent and very cogent information to help us understand what it is we're dealing with here. Really, every one of the statements have been compelling, and I thank each of the speakers. Now, I do not know whether it is I who didn't catch something here, or whether in any event you could just briefly remind me. When Ms. Esquivel of the World Bank first spoke, I seem to recall that she was talking about the FATF system that is juggling various different proposals, and by the way, this has filtered through every one of our statements. It has to do with the public register of the final beneficiaries. But she focused on the pluses and minuses of such registers, of such public, of those of the beneficial ownership lists. She focused on what the pluses were, but I'd like to know what the minuses were, what the disadvantages are, what are the drawbacks or the downside to this register. Here it is, says World Bank. When the countries started using this, before FATF modified the standard, there was a wide-ranging debate internationally on what? On the potential problem that might arise by information being put forward that had been, as it were, blessed by the state, which ended up being not a blessing at all, but precisely the contrary. It could have been totally false. Let me say that I speak and I say, this is the beneficiary of this company. And I realize that, guess what, the information is not really 100%. Well, I better speak up and say, this information is not reliable. Because if I do not do that, I am in effect polluting the system. Because who's going to know? And the people providing the services from a corporate standpoint are going to say, well, just a minute. What are you talking about? We're following the standards that you all set up, and we're doing our best to abide by them. And here it turns out that we're being fed something very different. And if there is no obligation to maintain the fidelity and veracity of what's on the registry, good luck. Where does that leave us? And so that's when the focus went very much on the standard itself. Because the in fact, the issue is that there isn't particular fall point. The system has any number of aspects which, and it's a plural, each of which could be subject to improvement because it might not be all that trustworthy. And who's going to do that? That's the question. There's the rub. And so what the FATF underscored was that, okay, it's all very nice to have a common bank of information, but you better be as sure as you possibly can be that that information is trustworthy. And that is precisely what we were talking about, because everybody in this room has to know that to ensure that a particular set of data is trustworthy, a very great deal of work goes into it, and there the Basel issues play a big role. And who's going to spot the discrepancies? And by the way, then what are you going to do? Here is where technology can be hugely helpful, especially when there is a cross comparison of what's being said. Thank you. I wonder whether any other expert, or for that matter, any other delegate has a question or input. This is from the chair. If that is not the case, let me simply say, picking up on what Maria Cecilia Alvarez mentioned, and also what Dr. Yares Esquivel stated earlier, the point is that this matter goes beyond a particular tax authority. In Panama, as I speak, there's a great deal of debate on this very point, where both the public sector and these state entities are taxed, no pun intended, with looking into who it is that is alleging what. Because it ain't necessarily so, as it turns out. You better check it out. And the point is hugely important. It's not unimportant. It has a huge importance. And so all of us experts need to understand that both for our region and internationally, this is a major consideration. So thank you so very much for enlightening us, for just beginning to map all this out. Because we're not here simply on two sides of, oh, well, there's the government fighting corruption, and then there are the other guys. No, we're all in it together. I think it was Andres Noble that said, we all have to play a role. There's no way anybody can go it alone. Good luck if you think you can, because this was the point made. And so I cannot thank all of you enough for the experience you have shared, both in the room, physically, and by the webcast, both on YouTube and Facebook, and indeed by Zoom. Thanks, everyone, and bravo to our experts.
La Secretaría Técnica recibió la confirmación de presentación de...
There are 8 states that have asked to intervene in this second part of our meeting, where those 8 states are going to set forth their particular history in these matters. So let us express our thanks to countries such as Bolivia, Belize, Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, and Panama are all kindly willing to share lessons learned in the context of the matter before us today. These presentations will be called upon in alphabetical order in Spanish. Please remember that each state will have 10 minutes, no more, to make the respective presentation. So I'm grateful to the conference department to put up a stop clock so people don't have to guess how many more minutes they've got. They'll be able to see it. And so will we. After the presentation, we will, of course, have a brief time for questions and answers if anyone wants to delve down a little bit more on what has been offered. If there are no questions, let me, without further ado, call upon Bolivia. This by way of joke.
Muchísimas gracias. Muy buenos días.
Thank you very much. A very warm welcome and greeting to all of the experts that are joining this evaluation group. I thank those who have already spoken to us. I am Susana Rios Laguna. I'm the Minister for Transparency and Institutional Struggle for Corporate Transparency in Bolivia. And we're going to share with you our experience with regard to the final beneficiary, final ownership of these various instruments. What have we been doing since 2010? And why 2010? Well, 2010 is the date from which we set up a new system in my country on public ownership and the single registry of state companies involved. There we know who will benefit from state contracts from 2012. A standard was implemented with regard to transfer prices, to which end, in order to identify all natural or juridical persons who are involved as a tax entity. 2227 is the number of the Supreme Court decree that sets forth the rules and regulations here, both nationally and for international effects, to determine who at the end of the day has beneficial ownership of the contracts involved. From 2021, the state once again took the reins here, and from that moment on, the registry focused very much on a listing of the companies involved and their registration numbers. In the new government that was launched in 2022, the final or beneficial ownership was drawn up as we presently have it with regard to commercial companies. Then last year, the plurinational directorate of the notary sector set up the plurinational notary system, that is a data system that allowed all commercial acts that might have gone through the hands of a notary public to be listed. There is where the beneficial ownership is listed, which is essential, as you might understand, to our fight against corruption. And in that context, the single registry was adopted, wherein all of the necessary data is compiled, so that our system against for transparency and against corruption serves as the yardstick. And we will this afternoon speak of this as an example of best practices that we in Bolivia have found to be very useful. It compiles the tax and tariff input. It talks about commercial registries and a number of different modifications that are tracked by the entire sector of notary publics. All of that together feeds into the single final registry with regard to the beneficial ownership. It can be verified, and it comes, as I've stated, from these various different sources. Most importantly, it helps for anybody carrying out a particular search, whether on the part of the citizens or on the part of the tax authorities. We're talking about a tool that, from a computer standpoint, is not only essential in general, but also and specifically with regard to all cases of money laundering or massive arms purchases, etc. We are continually vigilant as to what is being handled by that registry. And we think that it very much complements the points made by UNODC, the IADB, the World Bank, and numbers of others who have spoken this morning, because it opens the door to effective technical assistance so that we can be sure that our Decree 4904 designates the final beneficiary, how that is interpreted, and the speaker is listing a great number of other numbers of laws and sources thereof, pointing to a specific norm that clarifies who the final beneficiary is. And we will now, of course, ask for technical backstopping from different institutions so that we can improve the design of our registry in the course of this coming year, over 2024, tapping the indicators that are considered effective per the standards that have been identified thus far. So that is what I had to say, and I would like to thank all of you here. You may be sure that we are listening very carefully, not least to your kind offer of technical assistance for us to be able to strengthen our own system and move forward. As I say, this is a new system and launched in January, and it's going to go through December. Thank you.
Thank you, Bolivia. Thank you for presenting your experience. And we now would like to recognize Belize. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And good morning, colleagues. I am hoping my presentation will not be lengthy. The beneficial ownership and transparency to combat corruption is a relatively new undertaking in Belize. Okay. All right, and it's the result of Belize having undergone a number of scandals, one can say, in the past 15 years or so, resulting in the discovery of shell companies being used for money laundering. And so what has happened is that we have gone through a cycle of reviewing where our shortcomings were. And so the Financial Intelligence Unit went through a review process. And the most recent of these events came to light just about a year ago when the current administration was reviewing a contract that had been issued to a company, Brad's Gaming Group Limited. And it was discovered that it was a company registered with a lot of silent partners or unknown partners as such, no? And so in the past year and a half, Belize has undertaken, and this document here that the beneficial ownerships and Belize policy needs and opportunities is found in the link that is provided in the in the PowerPoint, right? And so it shares case studies and what is important, why is it important to collect this information, right? And so to combat tax evasion, corruption, money laundering, shell companies, and terrorism financing. And so what has occurred is that in the past year, the government of Belize has undertaken to do a number of amendments to many of its established acts. The Financial Services Commission Act was amended in 2023 to create an online business registry system portal to which all companies would be compelled, be committed to registering on. And then the Belize Companies Amendment Act of 2023, in section 93(1), it states that all entities shall file with the registrar its registers of beneficial owners. And then the Accounting Records Maintenance Amendment Act of 2023 requires all entities to maintain accounting records within Belize as its registered office or office of its registered agent in Belize. And then the Trust Amendment Act of 2023 makes it a duty to submit attestation reports, annual attestation on beneficial ownership for each trust. And so a number of all of these amendments, as you will have noticed, occurred within the past year, and all of them are, and they can be found on Belize's National Assembly.gov.bz portal, and all of them have been done to make sure that the different elements of committing the registry of all beneficial owners be implemented, but also where they would be accessible, and even what are the penalties if not implemented. And so the Financial Services Commission, which is the ultimate agency responsible for all of these acts, for all of these amendments as such, then is where we have access to all of this information through the portal. Both the registrar, the business registrar, has to keep all of this information and has only 6 months in which to make sure that all of these informations are updated. When all of these acts were amended, all companies' agents were given the deadline of January 1st to make sure that by that point in time, they were up to date with all of this information as such, no? And so all of these would then be implemented starting January 1st. The use of the portal, the registering of beneficial owners, the maintaining of accounting records that would then signal information, would acquire information, and attestation reports of beneficial owners are all to be provided to the company's registry, to the register. Now, it's important also because one of the things that we always suffer from, and we have found it in our constitution review, is that we have a lot of policies with not much teeth in those policies, right? In conducting public education throughout the country of Belize, we find out that Belize's constitution has one of the best code of conduct, which everybody and all public officers make an oath to, but that if they violate it, the question that the public always asks, if it's violated, so what? And we always recognize that there's not much teeth to it. And so in these amendments, they made sure that all the penalties would be listed, that companies would be held if this information was not forthcoming and was not provided on a timely basis. And so what the Financial Services Commission Act provides for any contravention or breach, a fine not exceeding $50,000, or by such terms of imprisonment not exceeding 1 year. The Belize Companies Amendment Act asks that any contravention and anyone found guilty of an offense is liable to an administrative fine imposed by the Commission. And what we find out is that the commission is given allowed an administrative fine of $100,000. Accounting Records Maintenance Amendment Act also allows for the commission to impose an administrative fine of up to $100,000 on any company or agent, business agent that is found guilty of violating these commitments. And Trust Amendment Act also has a summary conviction of fine exceeding $1,000 for each day or part thereof for which the contravention continues. In addition, the registrar may impose an administrative fine of up to $100,000. So these amendments have been focused in making sure that beneficial owners, the register of beneficial owners is adhered to, and the penalties associated with it are listed there, right? Belize has an official definition at this point in time of a beneficial owners in the Money Laundering and Terrorism Prevention Act. Companies must maintain a list of registrar or of these individuals who own or control 10% or more of the entity. This register must be kept at a company's registered office and or with their registered agent and provided to the Belize Companies Register. And the government requires financial entities, securities dealers, life insurance companies, brokers, or independent agencies and money service businesses to obtain beneficial ownership information from their clients. And so in having a conversation, a meeting with the financial services, the Director General of the Financial Services Commission, he reports that since its implementation, that 3 companies have already been suspended, and that as of February of 2024, 1 company has been actually closed down as a result of violations of these amendments as such. No? And so that is the presentation that we do at this point in time. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias al experto del Estado.
I thank Dr. Cecil Ross from Belize. And we now have the expert from Brazil.
Bem, bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everyone. We want to thank you for this opportunity. The tax auditor called me and asked me to come here and make a presentation. And I thought the presentations from the international organizations were so interesting. For example, Transparency International talked about the difficulties of exchanging information. The World Bank talked about the reality in Latin America. And one thing are regulations on paper, and something else are practical implementation and measures taken by the state to include businesses and legal entities. Now, with respect to beneficial ownership, this is a very sensitive topic. If we act, then we can address this issue, but if we do nothing, it allows for loopholes that give rise to money laundering and a whole host of other crimes. Well, we see, again, what is on paper is one thing and implementation is another thing. In Brazil, we have provisions that refer to beneficial ownership. So when we went to implement regulations, we found that there were different kinds of fraud with respect to individuals. It's something we've been working on. We've done quite a bit of work, actually. And entities or businesses that use people who are deceased or that don't exist. And we saw that there were huge gaps in our identification system. And this allowed for people to use their relatives or their employees as beneficial owners. And this leaves a door open because you can open up a bank account and transfer money that allows for money laundering, corruption, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, kidnapping, etc. It can allow for getting loans for businesses to buy vehicles, fraudulent loans. The identification system is the foundation of everything. In Brazil, we have different documents, IDs that can be used. There are different organizations that issue or institutions that issue IDs. So this, unfortunately, is a weak spot. We need a really strong ID system to be able to control companies and beneficial owners. Who are really the beneficial owners? They are individuals. And the ID system should not allow or should not be so weak as to allow deceased persons to be identified as the owners of companies, for example. We've seen different cases, cases where we had fraudulent beneficial owners identified. Now, for some years, we've had a new ID. We call this the National Validation Document. It's issued by the tax authorities. And this is the one that we are using currently. We're trying to close all loopholes in our fight against all of these crimes that I already listed. We are going to have a new system for IDing people, validating their ID. And with this document, you can access different public services. And the government is creating a public services platform. You can have a login with a certification. And so citizens can register. They can use this ID and enter into these platforms. And associated with this, we have different registries of individuals. And in recent years, we've been cleaning these up. In 2023, for example, 11 million people were eliminated from these databases. And so we've been doing that, and we've been doing the same thing with legal entities. We've been going in and cleaning these up and eliminating or suspending legal entities. In 2022, there were new regulations issued with respect to the property registry. And this did allow us to move forward and make progress with respect to supervision and oversight of legal entities. Because now we're much more efficient We're much more effective. It used to take us about 7 years to detect fraud with legal entities, and now it's a question of months. And that means that we can quickly, for example, freeze bank accounts, freeze investments. And the new regulations have a whole chapter about beneficial ownership. We have data sharing, active transparency with monthly publications. Now, we are talking about data that is not protected by tax secrecy, and we can have an exchange of data amongst different institutions. As again, I mentioned that there are limitations in this exchange of information. There is a national tax code in Brazil, and beneficial ownership to some extent is protected by the tax code. So the extent to which this information can be exchanged sometimes depends on a legal order, a court order, or an administrative order. A new approach is being used, and there is a draft bill before our Senate currently, which would bring about fundamental changes with respect to this situation. This would allow us greater access to data about beneficial ownership. Specifically, we would be able to quote-unquote evade these regulations about tax secrecy. And so this new law being considered would provide for public access to information on the beneficial owner's full name, year of birth, nationality, country of residence, entity, and the registration number of the entity, etc. So we're trying to improve the situation, and federal law enforcement wants to be able to work with the public prosecutor's office and other institutions on the matter of beneficial ownership. So I wanted to touch on these regulations because, of course, these regulations or new regulations would be important if we want to have effective investigation of fraud and other crimes. We have, again, many individuals who are supposedly beneficial owners, but they're actually non-existent or they're deceased. To conclude, I would mention that in Brazil, we've been making progress with respect to identifying individuals. We issue 20 million new ID cards a year. We're hoping to have just one ID card within several years. We are working on a new legislative bill, which will allow for the exchange of information amongst different institutions, law enforcement, and have greater transparency with respect to beneficial ownership so that citizens themselves can actually provide oversight. This kind of exchange of information is key so that joint action can be undertaken and we can fight against corruption in different sectors. As we know, organized crime is very agile. Criminal organizations are always one step ahead of authorities, so we need new tools to be able to fight against this. I'd like to thank Brazil for sharing Brazil's experience with us. We'd like to now give the floor to the expert from Colombia.
Hola, buenos días para todos.
Hello, good morning. As other colleagues have done, I would also like to thank you for the opportunity to share our experience and for enabling us to learn from other countries with respect to registries of beneficial ownership, which we know are very important to fight against money laundering, financing of terrorism, and a whole host of other crimes. And if I could share my screen, I would appreciate it. Just one moment, please.
Creo que ya.
Can you see it? Yes. Great, wonderful. With respect to, excuse me. I'm Juan Caicedo. I work at the tax authorities in Colombia, and we are under the General Directorate of Taxes. I have Dr. Melara with me. She is the Vice Director of our unit. This is where the registry of beneficial ownership is kept. In Colombia, with respect to beneficial ownership, we've been working on this for some years, and we have some laws here that helped us do this. We had a reform of tax laws in 2016, and at that point we had lists of beneficial ownership of companies, but only about 25% of companies had actually registered. Then in 2019, under Law 2010, we had more companies register. At that time, we did not have a definition of beneficial ownership. And so it wasn't until 2021 and the enactment of Law 2155 that we included FATF's definition of beneficial ownership. And so we changed the tax law to have one definition of beneficial ownership. This was very important for us so that we all understand what we are doing, what we are fighting against, and our register our beneficial owners is private. But the latest anti-corruption law allows for different authorities to access this registry. Institutions have an agreement with the unit that has the registry to be able to access it. And these are the different institutions listed here that can actually access the registry. This regulatory framework also includes different resolutions that are implementing regulations. And this establishes standards for the entire country. We have systems for identifying individuals and legal entities. These entities must provide information about beneficial ownership, and then we have different legal vehicles which have to report on beneficial ownership, such as trusts, for example. Then we have other resolutions, which are amendments to the laws and regulations that we have. We've compared our experience to other countries, and our experience is similar. But it has been difficult for companies to comply with our rules. Companies asked for extensions, although our deadline, our final deadline for reporting beneficial ownership was September of last year. Who must report beneficial ownership in Colombia? That is provided for in Resolution 00164. First of all national companies, for-profit or non-profit, that have three characteristics. They have their headquarters in Colombia, their main domicile is in Colombia, or they were chartered in accordance with Colombian law. There's a second group which must report. These are permanent establishments, and these are branches of foreign companies that are located in our country. Then we also have structures without legal status, but they were created or managed in Colombia. They use Colombian laws, regulations, or their trustee or legal status is that of a company or entity subject to tax laws in Colombia. And then, of course, we have the foreign legal entities as well. If a foreign company directly invests in Colombia, and this investment or this company must also report on its beneficial ownership. There are some entities that are not obliged to report on beneficial ownership, such as international organizations, embassies, diplomatic missions, among others. Now, what are the obligations with respect to the registry? There must be, well, these different requirements must be complied with. Every quarter, information must be sent if there's been any change, for example. If the beneficial owner changes, obviously that must be reported. Information must be preserved with respect to the company. There's also a framework for penalties. There are penalties established for not reporting, not updating the registry, or for reporting erroneous information, or for not providing information on clients.
As I stated earlier, last year, starting in September, we made all of this very, very clear. We publicized this, and we are beginning to spot check and carry out quality controls in these various different areas. The question of clear reporting has been paid particular attention for obvious reasons, and we made an effort to explain to the public in general why this is key. We have on the website of different entities, different means by which the concepts can be made clearer and how they can be applied. All of this is virtual. There is no need to go in person here or there. You have all kinds of support. There's a contact center that all of our citizens can use, a complaint center, the whole 9 yards. Trying to make it as user-friendly as possible in explaining to citizens what their obligations as citizens actually are. Now, we understand that the beneficial ownership question is of cross-cutting importance to all states that are serious about fighting corruption. This is key. We all get it. And what is also key is how one works hand in hand with other governmental entities. We did so with the presidency and numbers of other entities in order to absolutely not miss a chance to let everybody know how important it is to abide by these rules. We're working very hard, as I speak, on a report on which citizens need to state whether or not they were involved in this particular kind of exercise. And we have statistics to draw on now, and you can have a bird's eye view of them here. And more than 80% of those obligated did, in fact, report in timely fashion. But fiscal authorities are checking to see who is failing to report on time. There you have it. Thank you very much. Thank you. We appreciate this very clear and succinct report from Colombia. Next up, Guyana.
Good morning, everyone. Guyana is pleased to present on its legal framework and other mechanisms related to beneficial ownership transparency, which aid in the prevention of corruption. The government of Guyana is cognizant that beneficial ownership information can be obscured through shell companies spread across multiple jurisdictions, complex ownership structures, bearer shares, and with the use of professional intermediaries. Guyana has a robust legislative framework. For example, Guyana would have signed on to a number of conventions, agreements, and have incorporated those conventions into its domestic legislation. Among those legislation include, for example, our Criminal Law Offences Act, our Criminal Law Offences Act, which provides and criminalizes both corruption and bribery. Sorry about that delay. I'm trying to share the presentation. I'll go on. The term public officer, public servant includes high offices such as president, cabinet members, the judiciary, police officers, and other law enforcement officers. The Criminal Law Offences Act also provides dissuasive penalties and liabilities, criminal liabilities, ranging from 2 to 7 years. Among the other legislation that Guyana has put in place includes, for example, its Companies Act, the Deeds Registry Act, the Cooperative Societies Act, and the Friendly Societies Act. And quite recently, we would have enacted the Compliance Commissions Act. Some of the provisions in these acts, for example, has a clear definition for beneficial ownership. Maintenance of information by companies themselves. They are required to keep a list of their registered shareholders. Sanctions for non-compliance is also included in that legislation. Similar provisions are there in the Cooperative Societies Act and the Friendly Societies Act. A very key legislation in Guyana is Anti-Money Laundering and Countering the Financing of Terrorism Act and its regulations, which mandates that reporting entities maintain information on its customers. Financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses are also among the categories of reporting entities required to maintain beneficial ownership information. Another important aspect of our legislation is that corruption and bribery are listed as predicate offense in our money laundering law. And this could trigger an STR being filed by a reporting entity. A key important aspect of the AML legislation as well is that the obligations of the reporting entities are supervised by a supervisory authority, which ensures that those entities under their supervision comply with those obligations, failing which sanctions could be imposed. Another important measure that Guyana has in place is a system for fit and proper criteria. Fit and proper criteria requires licensing agencies to verify the beneficial owners and conduct an inquiry or an investigation into certain aspect of the character of those companies that may wish to register or apply for a license. A number of other legislation also support Guyana's framework. For example, we have an Integrity Commissions Act and a Code of Conduct. And that act allows for public officers to declare assets on an annual basis. There is also a local content legislation, which provides for beneficial ownership for companies involved in the oil and gas sector in Guyana. Another key mechanism that Guyana has is that Guyana subscribes to the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which is the global standard on good governance within the natural resources sector. Complementing our framework, we have public agencies such as Public National Tender Board Administration, and that agency has a public website where information on bidders registered, contracts awarded, and various information is available so the public can view the website, and the information there is very transparent. There is also the Public Procurement Commission, which is an independent constitutional body which maintains public procurement, ensure that the Public Procurement Act is administered and monitored. In addition to all of this, Guyana has coordinating mechanisms. In fact, it has two committees, one for the anti-corruption, which involves a number of agencies that come together to monitor the various conventions that Guyana would have signed on to. And then there is the AML-CFT Coordinating Committee. Sitting on that committee also, there are a number of law enforcement agencies and competent authorities that discuss matters relating to money laundering. So in a nutshell, Guyana has what we call a multi-pronged approach to obtaining beneficial ownership, which is in the fight of corruption. Key element of this process is that MOUs were signed between all these agencies so that the police and other competent authorities can access information from the registry. So if there is a criminal matter being investigated, for example, for corruption, access to that information is readily available, and those agencies can request that information. So some of the measures that Guyana will ensure or continue to ensure is to ensure training is always in place, and this is what we have been doing on an ongoing basis. Domestic and international cooperation is also grounded in our laws, and the MOUs that are formed between those companies ensure that coordination of activities and action plan items are coordinated very effectively. Very important is that Guyana would have conducted a national risk assessment. That national risk assessment would have identified sanctions that were imposed, and I would not be able to go through all the statistics at this presentation, but the report is publicly available on the Financial Intelligence Unit website. So I would invite interested parties to view that report, where it has a number of typologies and trends related to beneficial ownership information. So basically, those are some of the mechanisms that Guyana has related to its beneficial ownership regime, and that ensures that corruption is prevented in Guyana. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a la experta de Guyana. En este momento vamos.
Thank you very much. We are now going to hear Haiti for their presentation. Haiti has the floor.
No observamos ahora mismo.
We don't see Haiti, says the chair, so we will move along for the moment in hopes that Haiti will be ready next up. So without further ado, we are going to turn to Jamaica for their presentation. Go right ahead.
Madam President, members of the Committee of Experts, I'm not entirely certain whether you are able to hear me.
We can hear you.
Thank you. Madam President, members of the Committee of Experts and of the Technical Secretariat, other delegates, good afternoon. My name is Shelley Ann Thompson, and I'm an Assistant Attorney General in the Attorney General's Chambers, Jamaica. The government of Jamaica.
Ms. Shelley, I'm sorry for the interruption, but we cannot see your image.
Thank you. My camera is on, so I'm not entirely certain why that is. I'm having some technical difficulties. My camera is on. I'm noting that you can't see. If that is going to be a challenge, perhaps the technical could assist me, and perhaps someone else could go, the next state could go while we sort out these technical issues.
What we might do, says the chair, is to have the technical people here help out. Wouldn't that be a thought? If there could be technical support to offer, that might be helpful to the state in question. And meanwhile, we'll move to the next country and come back to Jamaica immediately thereafter. That's my input, says the chair. If that is amenable, let us turn to Panama, and we'll pick up where we left off after that. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary, everyone. Hi. We are pleased to have with us the superintendent, that is Ms. Daida Carrizo Castillo, and on behalf of the private sector, Mr. Candelario Santana, who is a member of the officials that check on best practices. Here we go. Daida Carrizo Castillero, Superintendent of Non-Financial Subjects.
Hola, muy buenos días.
The interpreter is hearing the speaker as if she were at the bottom of a well. This is very, very hard to hear with an echo. Gonna do the best I can. It is a miserable sound. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to pick up on what Panama has done in this context. Back in 2019, at the beginning of President Cortizo's tenure, we set up a very high-level group to control, that is, to survey and prevent corruption in any respect, because we understand that this erodes our democracy in every respect, not least in the financial area. So we have a roadmap. Going to try to share it. The interpreter again regrets this is very poor sound. We normally would not interpret with this sound. Really making an effort, guessing half of what it said.
No aparece. Si me podrían habilitar, por favor, para compartir pantalla. O si no, hago la presentación
Si gusta,
directamente.
si retira, nosotros podemos transmitirla desde acá.
Sí.
We could transmit your material from here. That might be best, says the local technician here in Washington. Well, that might help us. Perhaps we could move on to the third slide. Next. Here's our roadmap in terms of our surveillance of our different institutions. Recommendation 24 speaks to legal entities with regard to the beneficial ownership. We're talking about transparency thereof. We have the basic law on that subject and our supervision of non-financial entities. This superintendency is quite recent, you understand, but our hope is to ensure that the system makes as much sense and is as effective as possible. This includes the legal team that works with us. They're called residents, and with a very clear eye on beneficial ownership. BF in the acronym that you see on the screen, Beneficiarios Finales. We focus on the corporate sector with the assistance of the World Bank, inter alia. And once we have identified specific risks and vulnerabilities that we had to recognize were inherent in the Panamanian system, we tried to gird up the situation and to strengthen the non-financial subjects with the hopes that we would come up a single list of beneficial owners. Register, burden, verification, and access, and timely access by the state authorities. We've set up a guide of final owners and how with the help of EU Global Facility, we could make it simpler. Over 4 years, we have adopted this multiple approach, and it has made a difference with spot supervisions in terms of these beneficial ownerships and the single list thereof. Next. You have here the statistics that go back to 2019 through 2023, as you can see on the slide. 3,494 supervisions were carried out with the help of specialized lawyers. And overall, 13,000, actually more than 13,500 subjects were covered with training of the people involved, including lawyers, how this should be carried out, what these supervisions should entail, and how these regulated entities needed to be approached. And what this has meant at the end of the day, thankfully, is that we are complying to a much larger extent with the goals we had set for ourselves. And there is also, and this is not unimportant, a better understanding by the sectors in question as to how important the entire exercise is and how critical their own compliance can be. 2022, please look at this slide over to the left. That, as we all remember, was when COVID struck us. But we came up from that moment on with some very significant and clear steps forward. We have an authority that launched this platform as of 2022. And this 2022 platform, November 2022 platform, is geared towards our competent authorities, which have direct access to the entities that are subject to those controls. Now, registry to be subject to the platform is key. And I cannot begin to tell you the number of training sessions that we have launched over this time, frankly, to good avail, with the help of the United Kingdom and others. And this has, frankly, yielded very good results, happy to say. We have a very wide-ranging and very strong team of technical experts that are helping us. This is a broad platform. And anybody thinking of such a thing, and we do recommend it, needs to know coming in that it is quite a task, and you better have the numbers of players and well-trained people that are going to help you pull it off. Not a done deal coming in. This indeed is certainly contingent on ongoing communication with the obligated people. We've been able to tackle more than 7,000 different cases over the course of a year. And little by little, we have streamlined the process, and it's become better. Now, I'm moving through these pillars from left to right, and I'm on the next to the last. This is verification or compliance in a way. This is based on an agreement as to the submission of data from X number of institutions over a period of time. There's a methodology set up. There is a risk-based system with competent authorities that have their role to play. At the end of the day, this is access to the platform as of November 2022. There is direct access since then. Next. Here you have a smattering of the various different teams that we have set up. Development of public policies to prevent what we seek to prevent and to boost what we hope will be improved. And we've received tremendous cooperation from various international bodies and multilateral agencies, all of which has been, needless to say, extremely opportune and welcome. World Bank, IADB, you name it, in the United Kingdom, inter alia. And various different institutions that work in the area of prevention and fiscal probity. People working against fraud and capital flight. We are now a reference point, I'm happy to say. This is working. And our institutional track record now is something we are going to be very happy to share, should you be interested.
Muchísimas gracias, Superintendente. En estos momentos.
Thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Mr. Candelario Santana, who is the head of compliance in Panama. He's with us. Thank you.
Experts, I'm happy to talk about implementation from the private sector. And we are basically attorneys that set up legal entities. And from that point on, when we set up these legal entities, we play an important role. And so we're trying to raise awareness in the private sector about regulations and about the obligations that attorneys have with respect to beneficial ownership. And many times there is this issue of thresholds, percentages. In Panama, we have different criteria with respect to establishing beneficial ownership, depending on whether it's 25%, 10%, or 5% risk, knowing your client. And based thereon, we need to see who controls the entity. It depends on what percentage of shares you have. So the legislation provides that we must always be up to date on the regulations and laws. So we're always updating information, updating our knowledge about the law. If there are any changes in shareholders, for example, of legal entities, we have to make reports within 15 days. And the attorney, the legal representative, has the obligation to do so. If not, he or she will be penalized. So we are all aware of the importance of fighting against corruption. I know that there are investments in real estate, investments in about which we didn't know who the beneficial owners were. Now, attorneys, or not just attorneys, are aware of obligations with respect to beneficial ownership. Now the financial sector is more mature, understands the importance of beneficial ownership. And so to some extent, Panama was on a blacklist, but I think thanks to the efforts of everyone in the private sector, we have come off those lists. And so in the private sector, we're fighting against this kind of corruption. Thank you. We thank the participation of Panama. We thank the superintendent. And we thank Catherine, Gabrielle, and all the team for weighing in. We'd like to give the floor now to Guatemala.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chair. Experts, I'd like to thank you once again for allowing me to be here. This is the first time I've been at MESASIC. As I stated yesterday, I recently became executive director of the anti-corruption unit in a difficult context in Guatemala, as I'm sure that you heard about with respect to our presidential transition, but this has provided for a great opportunity to have a robust fight against corruption. So I think it's very relevant that we're talking about the law on beneficial ownership in Guatemala. We have a bill in our legislator, and the executive is about actually to present this bill, and we believe that the knowledge that we gain here, anything we garner, can help us to comply with international standards and best practices of the member states represented here. We have Deputy Villagran here with us. She has been an ally in fighting for the anti-corruption agenda in our Congress, and I'm sure that we can continue to work together with her. I'd like to reiterate the message of President Arevalo. I won't be able to be here tomorrow. We will have a different advisor here. That's why I asked to be able to speak today. But I want to talk about the work we've been doing, and I wanted to, again, reiterate the vision of President Arevalo, which is zero tolerance to corruption. He was elected because the Guatemalan people are fed up with the institutional deterioration in our country, and given this social protest, we've been able to make the fight against corruption a priority, a cross-cutting priority, a comprehensive priority through the agreement with the anti-corruption unit. We have a long-term vision, one that looks to identify sources of corruption in the state and come up with public policies that can address this in an ongoing manner. So what we're looking to do is prevent corruption before it eats away at the foundations of our state. We hope to have ongoing dialogue. We hope to have support to be able to promote what we're doing well and improve what we're not doing well. We are looking forward to the review of our standards. This afternoon, we're meeting with the Department of Legal Affairs at the OAS to discuss this. Again, our administration just came in, and so we're looking forward to technical discussions in this sense. Again, I wanted to thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share our experience here. And we appreciate the other member states presenting their experiences. So on behalf of President Arevalo and Vice President Herrera, we are fully committed to a robust agenda of transparency and to the eradication of the scourge of corruption. With that, I will not take up more of your time, and I appreciate you allowing me to speak. Thank you. I thank the expert from Guatemala. We would now like to give the floor to Jamaica. I believe that Jamaica's technical issues have been resolved, and so we want to hear about Jamaica's experience with respect to transparency of beneficial ownership. You have the floor, madam. I'm sorry. Unfortunately, we can see you now, but we cannot hear you.
We can hear you. I don't know if the technicians can help us, because I see that your microphone is on. It's just that we can't hear any sound.
Bueno, todavía estamos ante la situación.
We're still trying to resolve technical difficulties with Jamaica. So what we suggest is that we all go to lunch now. If you can be back here, please, at 2:15, and we'll hear the last presentation, which will be Jamaica's. So please be punctual, and we'll see you at 2:15. I hope you have a wonderful lunch. Thank you.